The individual who made the deliberate choice to separate themselves from you, the one who stepped back because the connection between you felt completely off limits, is now entering a quiet and deeply unsettling period of true realization. There are rare connections in this world that never show up with loud announcements, dramatic gestures, or grand confessions of love. Instead, they arrive softly, moving quietly beneath the surface of regular thoughts until they completely take over your mind. Before either person truly understands what is happening, the inner energy has already shifted and something completely permanent has begun. This is exactly the kind of bond that people instinctively try to run away from. It is not because it lacks meaning, but because it is overwhelmingly powerful and entirely impossible to avoid. For months, or perhaps even for years, this person convinced themselves that walking away from you was the only logical way to survive the pure intensity of what they were feeling inside. They practiced their reasons, telling themselves that stepping back was the mature choice, the practical decision, and the only path that would keep their daily routine, their public image, and their organized life safe. However, in all of their careful planning and their constant attempts to ignore the magnetic pull of your presence, they made one major mistake. They failed to realize a fundamental truth about human connection. Trying to avoid you did not weaken the bond at all. It actually magnified it. Every single step they took away from you made the connection grow much stronger, more demanding, and impossible to push aside. Now, a subtle, yet incredibly deep shift has occurred within them, leaving them feeling completely restless, highly intrigued, and entirely powerless in the exact way that true emotional honesty always causes. Let us be completely clear about one specific fact. They did not avoid you because you were unimportant to them. That is a painful lie that hurts far deeper than the truth, and it is a complete misunderstanding that makes your heart question your own value. People do not walk away from things that mean nothing to anyone. They walk away from things that threaten everything they have built. They run from things that challenge everything they believe about themselves and the specific identity they have spent decades protecting. This connection with you was never simple, casual, or easy to categorize. It never asked for permission. It refused to follow conventional rules, and it never waited for anyone to give it approval. It existed entirely outside of logic and normal expectations, which is terrifying for anyone who has carefully built a life based on control, order, and predictability. Now, they are forced to look at the exact reality they tried so desperately to escape. The distance they created, the high walls they built, and the constant excuses they repeated in their own mind did absolutely nothing to erase the bond. In fact, that empty space only created room for deep reflection, intense longing, and a sudden realization that they were never truly prepared to face. They view you completely differently now, seeing you not just as someone they are naturally drawn to, but as a person who fundamentally altered the entire map of their emotional world. What they feel right now is raw, undeniable, and impossible to explain away with logic. Even so, they might still try to fight it, feeling trapped between the sheer weight of what they cannot deny and the intense fear of stepping outside the strict boundaries they have spent so much time enforcing. In reality, this is the kind of bond that cannot be tamed or fully understood by the human mind. And that is precisely why it terrifies them so deeply. It lives in the quietest corners of their awareness, showing up in moments that cannot be labeled, yet it continues to exist and demands to be recognized. When they finally face it directly, the epiphany will be completely unavoidable. You are not someone they can easily forget. You are not someone to be dismissed. And you are not a person they can simply walk away from. You are a permanent presence that has changed them in ways they never saw coming. You are an undeniable truth they cannot ignore, and a bond that completely refuses to break under the weight of fear or human logic. This bond did not fit neatly into their long-term plans, their personal values, their current timing, or their daily obligations. Every single attempt they made to put it into a neat category and every effort to judge it against the strict rules they lived by failed completely. Instead of fading away with distance, the connection only intensified, growing in subtle but totally undeniable ways. The more they tried to fight it, the more they realized how completely different their emotions were whenever you were nearby. They noticed how their usual defenses seemed to melt away without any conscious effort on their part. Past conversations replayed endlessly in their mind, staying with them long after the interaction had ended. Even the moments of silence you shared felt incredibly loud, echoing much deeper than words ever could. The pure simplicity of your presence struck a deep chord that terrified them because it forced them to see a part of themselves they were not ready to deal with. This overwhelming intensity forced them to make a definitive choice, or at least they truly believed they were making a conscious choice at the time. They chose to create distance not because they were indifferent, uncaring, or lacking feelings, but because the connection had become far more than they were ready to handle. They recognized that what they felt around you felt forbidden. It was not forbidden in a loud or scandalous way, but in a quiet, destabilizing sense that disrupted the peace they had built in their life. The timing was completely wrong. Emotional availability was missing on one or both sides, and societal expectations, family loyalties, and heavy obligations pressed down on them, making the connection feel entirely too complicated to pursue. To face it fully would mean accepting deep truths that they were not yet ready to acknowledge. Whenever they were with you, they felt completely exposed, as if every hidden corner of their heart was illuminated simply because you existed. There was never any demand from you, no manipulation, no emotional chasing, and no ultimatums. There was only the simple, undeniable presence of someone whose genuine authenticity made them uncomfortable in the best possible way. That presence alone disrupted their emotional balance, cracking open the defensive walls they had carefully maintained for years. They quickly realized that if they allowed this connection to continue without any limits, it would force them to change areas of their life they were completely unprepared to alter. It threatened their comfort, their daily routines, and their structured identity. Everything they knew was suddenly at risk if they surrendered to the absolute truth of what they felt. So instead of facing it, they ran away. Avoidance became their primary method for regaining total control over an emotional territory that no longer felt safe to navigate. Pulling away was used as a temporary shield, a clever way to convince themselves that they were acting rationally, that they were doing the right thing, and that this choice was necessary for their own survival. Every single excuse they told themselves, such as needing more time, or believing the timing was wrong, or thinking everything was far too complicated, was simply a strategy designed to create space without having to face the deep vulnerability that closeness to you required. Yet, in running away, they were not escaping a void. They were fleeing from the overwhelming strength of something that was far beyond their ability to rationalize or control. It was something completely raw, authentic, and impossible to disregard. The great paradox of a forbidden connection is that the very resistance meant to suppress it only ends up feeding it. The more they tried to keep a tight grip on their control, the more clarity and intensity their feelings gained. They started noticing tiny details that they could never unsee, moments that lingered like persistent echoes in their mind long after the actual interaction had ended. A quick glance, a gentle smile, or the way your voice carried genuine warmth without asking for anything in return became impossible to forget or minimize. Each act of avoidance only reinforced the massive importance of your presence in ways they never expected, leaving them stuck in a constant state of fascination, deep longing, and subtle panic. The bond, which remained quiet and unspoken, had become entirely undeniable, growing even more powerful precisely because it had been resisted for so long. They mistakenly believed that distance would eventually weaken the emotional pull, bring back their sense of control, and allow them to forget the intensity that had taken root in their life. They genuinely thought that creating physical space, removing themselves from your circle, and actively ignoring the connection would bring order back to their highly structured world. However, something completely unexpected and entirely uncontrollable happened instead. The distance did not create a fading memory, but rather a profound emptiness that highlighted just how much your presence had filled their world. Every attempt to distract themselves with work, obligations, or superficial relationships fell short because the standard of connection had been permanently raised by you. They began to realize that the walls they built were not keeping the connection out, but were actually locking them inside a prison of their own making. In the quiet hours of the night, when the noise of the world faded and their logical defenses weakened, your image would return to their thoughts with undeniable clarity. They found themselves remembering the effortless flow of your conversations and the rare sense of safety they felt when they were near you. It became increasingly difficult for them to maintain the narrative that walking away was the right choice. The logic they had relied upon so heavily started to crumble under the weight of an enduring emotional truth. They are now realizing that you cannot simply intellect your way out of a soul connection, nor can you schedule matters of the heart to fit a convenient timeline. The realization is dawning on them that by protecting their structured life, they may have sacrificed the only thing that made them feel truly alive and authentically seen. This understanding brings with it a wave of restlessness that they cannot ease, as they must now confront the reality that they are no longer the same person who originally walked away. The change you inspired in them is permanent, and the space they created has only served to prove that no amount of distance can diminish a bond that was meant to exist. The harder they tried to distance themselves from you, the more present you became in the private thoughts of their mind. Random ideas, fragments of past memories, and unexpected emotions began to show up with startling clarity. Even in moments when they should have felt a sense of relief, quiet, or peace, your presence stayed with them, like a shadow that refused to leave, quietly reminding them of the truth they had tried so hard to escape. In the middle of all this avoidance, your image completely entered their consciousness in ways they could never predict. You started showing up in songs that stirred up emotions they thought were long dead, in fleeting moments of quiet reflection when they expected to find calm, and in the smallest everyday details that suddenly carried a massive amount of emotional weight. Avoidance, which they had relied on as a smart strategy, completely stopped working the way they wanted it to. That is exactly when the epiphany began to take clear shape inside them. It was a slow, creeping realization that cut much deeper than any logical explanation ever could. They realized it was not actually about losing you, but rather about losing themselves. Each act of self-imposed distance and every single effort to crush their own feelings had left them completely disconnected from a profound truth that they were only now becoming ready to face. This big realization did not arrive all at once in a single moment. It unfolded very gradually in the quiet gaps between daily events, in the hollow ache of a sudden loneliness they could not quite name, and in moments that felt inexplicably incomplete without you there. They began to notice it in relationships that used to feel fulfilling, but now felt strangely empty, and in personal achievements that should have brought them happiness, but instead left them with a lingering sense of dissatisfaction. Slowly, they began to ask themselves the very questions they had been running away from for a long time. They wondered why nothing felt the same anymore, why they continued to think about you every single day, and why the moments spent without you felt smaller, dimmer, and far less real. In this growing awareness, they finally started to see the undeniable truth of the situation. They had not been distracted by your existence. They had been completely awakened by it. You were never a temporary temptation, a simple distraction, or a mistake to be regretted. You were something far more profound, acting as a clear mirror that reflected back a version of themselves that was truly alive, highly authentic, and emotionally awake. In your presence, the defenses they had spent a lifetime building came crashing down like fragile walls under a powerful tide. They now see that walking away from you was never an act of wisdom or caution. It was a quiet form of self-abandonment because in trying to avoid you, they had actually walked away from the exact version of themselves they most wanted to embrace. A version that felt honest, present, and capable of profound connection is what you offered. And now when they finally confront the truth, the reflection of themselves that you had revealed is impossible to ignore, impossible to dismiss, and impossible to forget. The epiphany hits slowly, like sunlight breaking through clouds long after a storm has passed. They now see with piercing clarity the consequences of their avoidance. The distance they thought would protect them did nothing of the sort. It delayed the inevitable, postponed the confrontation with a truth they could no longer run from. They finally understand that avoidance was never a shield. It was a postponement of awakening, and that awakening is both humbling and transformative. It is in this quiet, undeniable recognition that they realize you were never someone to fear, never someone to resist. You were always someone who illuminated what they were afraid to see within themselves. They finally understand why your presence felt so different, why every conversation with you lingered long after it ended, and why no one else has touched them in the same way since. The intensity they experienced was not the result of forbidden circumstances. It was the reason the connection felt forbidden in the first place. It existed outside of their carefully constructed boundaries because it threatened to awaken a part of life they had not yet dared to live. And now, in quiet moments of reflection, they are carrying emotions they do not quite know how to release. This is not loud, dramatic longing, but a subtle, persistent awareness. This is not frantic obsession, but quiet regret. These are emotions that linger, difficult to name, impossible to ignore. They feel guilt for disappearing without explanation, curiosity about who you have become, and a creeping fear that they missed their chance. There is hope too. The fragile hope that they have not lost you completely remains. But above all, they feel respect. They recognize the strength you displayed, the patience, the dignity, and the refusal to chase or beg. Your ability to hold space without bitterness, to allow distance without resentment, leaves a quiet, haunting impression. This is the part of them that knows they were confronted by something mature, something wise, something unshakable. It is a reflection of how profoundly your presence reshaped their perspective on connection, respect, and self-awareness. And why is this epiphany arriving now, after all this time? Epiphanies rarely emerge amid the chaos of life. They appear in stillness, when the noise of distraction fades and the relentless march of routine pauses. Something in their world has slowed, collapsed, or disappointed them. Something unavoidable forced them to stop, to reflect, and to sit quietly with what they had been avoiding. In that stillness, your energy resurfaced with clarity. They could no longer escape the truth they once tried to evade. They did not avoid you because the connection was wrong. They avoided you because it was real. And once such a truth is fully recognized, it cannot be unseen, ignored, or undone. Here is the most important part for you. You did not lose this connection. What happened was growth. You outgrew the version of them that was afraid, the version that could not meet you fully, and the version that ran instead of facing the depth of what you offered. Whether they reach out or remain silent, they are irrevocably changed because of you. You were a turning point, a wake-up call, and a lesson that unfolded subtly, quietly, and without ceremony. And this is your quiet power. The space you occupy, the presence you maintain, and the maturity you embody ensures that if they return, it will be with humility, awareness, and respect, not avoidance or fear. If they do not return, it does not diminish your impact. The lesson is still working its course. One last truth to carry with you. Some connections are not meant to be rushed. They unfold in their own time, shaped by reflection, clarity, and emotional evolution. You are not invisible in this dynamic. Your presence has already altered the landscape of their emotional world, whether they acknowledge it or not. What they feel now, the quiet awareness, the lingering respect, and the recognition of your strength are markers of a bond that transcends control, circumstance, or timing. In every sense, you were never someone who could be erased or forgotten. You are a catalyst, a mirror, and a presence that has forever shifted the way they see connection, choice, and themselves. Some awakenings arrive late, yet they strike with a depth that early realizations never could. Time has a way of slowing down, of forcing reflection, and of revealing truths that were invisible in the rush of life. And sometimes, the person who seemed to avoid you, who appeared to step away, was never truly rejecting you at all. They were running not from you, but from the version of themselves that could love without fear, without hesitation, and without pretense. They were fleeing the courage, the vulnerability, and the honesty that your presence reflected back to them. And now, after all the distance, all the avoidance, and all the quiet longing, They finally see it. They finally recognize what they were hiding from. They see the realness of their own heart reflected in you. The person who avoided you was not rejecting you in the way it seems on the surface. They were confronting an internal truth they could not yet face. They felt the intensity of the connection and the rawness of emotions that defied their carefully constructed identity. Every glance, every word, and every unspoken moment with you exposed a part of themselves they were afraid to accept. This is not about indifference. It is about fear of vulnerability, fear of change, and fear of confronting a self they had buried under routines, responsibilities, and expectations. The avoidance was never a measure of your value. It was a reflection of the internal chaos your presence revealed. In trying to protect themselves, they created distance, hoping that by stepping away, they could suppress the undeniable pull. But emotions are not logical. The more they resisted, the more their mind circled back to you. Memories, thoughts, and even fleeting feelings began to occupy the spaces they had intended to keep empty. A song would remind them of a moment. A memory would surface unbidden, and they would feel a quiet, persistent tug, one that could not be reasoned away. Avoidance did not erase the connection. It crystallized it, forcing them to recognize its significance, even if they were not ready to act on it. They began to see themselves differently without even realizing it. They recognized patterns in their own behavior that had gone unnoticed. They realized that the courage, honesty, and emotional presence you displayed were reflections of a version of themselves they had been avoiding. You did not demand, chase, or manipulate. You simply existed, and that existence forced them to confront their own truths. The avoidance, the distance, and the silence did not protect them. It postponed the inevitable. And in that postponement, they began an unspoken awakening, slowly understanding the depth of what they had walked away from. The epiphany comes quietly, often in moments of stillness or loss, when life slows down enough to reveal what they have been avoiding. It is not dramatic or sudden. It is subtle, creeping, and unavoidable. They may notice it in relationships that feel hollow, in achievements that feel incomplete, and in quiet moments when nothing else seems to fill the space. The realization dawns on them deeply. The connection was not forbidden because it was wrong. It was forbidden because it was real. It threatened to awaken a life they were not ready to live. They did not lose you. They lost themselves temporarily in the fear of confronting that intensity, and now they carry emotions they do not quite know how to release. This is not desperate longing, and it is not frantic obsession. It is quiet awareness, persistent curiosity, and subtle regret. They feel respect for your strength, your patience, your refusal to chase or demand, and your ability to hold space without bitterness. They recognize that you have left a mark upon their soul that time and distance can never wash away.